Her hands trembled the first time she opened the door to that quiet office. It smelled of lavender candles and leather-bound books, a strange mix of calm and authority. She didn't want to be there, not really. Therapy felt like admitting defeat, like saying her heart was too broken to fix on its own. But something about the woman waiting inside, her steady eyes, her gentle smile, her voice that sounded like it belonged in a softer world, kept her rooted in place. She was told this therapist cost $500 an hour, and that alone made her question what she was doing. Who spends that kind of money just to talk? But she stayed, because she had run out of people to listen, and maybe it was worth the price of being heard. She sat down on the soft couch across from her, shifting nervously as if the cushions themselves might betray her secrets. The therapist leaned forward, pen in hand, but didn't write anything. She just looked at her, as if waiting for her to breathe. The silence wasn't heavy, it was patient. She had never experienced that before, someone willing to wait, to let her gather herself instead of rushing her words. She tried to joke about the price, saying she could buy a new phone with that hour, but the therapist only smiled and said, "You're investing in yourself." And for some reason, those words stung more than any memory she was hiding. The first session wasn't about confessions. It was about trust, about learning if her walls could withstand the pressure of being seen. She talked in circles about her job, her mother, about how she hated mornings and loved coffee, all the safe little details of a life half-lived. The therapist listened to it all, not once glancing at the clock, though she must have known the minutes were sliding away. Every nod, every tilt of her head, every quiet seemed to say, "I see more than what you're saying." That both terrified and soothed her. She wanted to bolt out the door, and she wanted to stay forever. As the weeks passed, the sessions deepened. What began as guarded jokes turned into trembling confessions. She spoke of loneliness that crept into her bed at night like an unwelcome lover. She spoke of the emptiness left by a woman she once thought was her forever, the betrayal that cracked her open in ways she couldn't patch. And every time she broke, the therapist's voice was there like a warm blanket, wrapping around her jagged edges. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said once, and it nearly brought her to tears. No one had ever offered that before, not with such weight, not with such gentleness. There was one evening, a storm raging outside the window, when the air between them changed. The room was darker than usual, lit only by the soft lamp on the desk. She had been talking about love, about how it had always felt like something dangerous, something sharp. Her therapist leaned forward then, her eyes glistening in the lamplight, and said softly, "Love isn't meant to cut you. It's meant to hold you." The words lingered in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. She felt something shift inside her, a crack in the armor she thought she would never remove. She wanted to ask why her voice shook when she said it, why her gaze lingered too long, but she swallowed the question. Some things felt too fragile to touch. She began to look forward to those sessions more than anything else. It wasn't just therapy anymore. It was escape, it was belonging, it was the only hour of her week where she felt like she wasn't invisible. The world outside demanded she be strong, unbroken, polished. But in that room, she could be raw. She could be messy. She could be exactly who she was without apology. And each time she walked out, the air felt different, as if her lungs had learned how to breathe again. But behind every step of healing, there was something else growing quietly, dangerously, in the shadows of her heart. She noticed the way her therapist's hand brushed her own when passing a glass of water. She noticed the softness in her smile when their eyes caught for just a second too long. And though she told herself it was foolish, unprofessional, impossible, she couldn't help the way her pulse quickened each time the session began. She had gone there to be healed, not to fall into something she couldn't name. Yet with every word, every silence, every moment of being seen, she was falling, slowly, quietly, and the rain had stopped that evening, leaving the city washed clean, but inside her chest the storm had only begun. She told herself it was therapy, nothing more, but the way her body reacted betrayed her every time she walked into that office. She felt it in her throat, the way words stumbled out as if caught between fear and longing. She felt it in her hands, restless in her lap, twisting together like they were holding back secrets they had no right to confess. She wanted to believe it was admiration, gratitude, respect for someone who helped her find pieces of herself she thought she had lost. But the truth clawed at her in the quiet moments. What she felt wasn't the safety of a patient, it was the hunger of a woman who had been starved of touch for too long. The therapist noticed her unease, though she never said it outright. Instead, she began to ask questions that made her pause, questions that slid past the surface of her stories and dug into the spaces she didn't want touched. "When you imagine safety, what does it look like?" she asked once, and she didn't know how to answer. She wanted to say, "It looks like you," but instead she muttered something about childhood bedrooms and books she used to love. Yet the words lingered in her mind long after she left, growing roots she couldn't pull out. Safety looked like those eyes holding her steady, like that voice softening her sharp edges, like that presence that made her feel as though she wasn't too much to handle. One night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her thoughts looping endlessly. She had sworn off love after her last heartbreak, had promised herself she would never again give her heart to someone who could shatter it. But this felt different, terrifyingly different. It wasn't about fireworks or passion that burned too hot. It was about peace. It was about the way she could breathe when she was around her therapist, how her chest didn't feel like a cage anymore. She hated herself for thinking it, hated the idea that she was crossing a line that should never be crossed. But the truth was undeniable. She wanted more than words. She wanted to know how those hands would feel, not just holding a pen, but holding her. The sessions became heavier after that. Not because of the topics she brought up, but because of the tension that sat unspoken between them. Every smile lingered too long. Every pause carried weight. Every glance felt like it carried secrets. She was certain her therapist felt it too, though neither of them dared to name it. She could see it in the way her lips parted slightly when their eyes met, in the way her voice softened when the session was ending, as if she didn't want to let her go. These small details fed her, gave her hope, but also scared her more than anything. Because if it was real, if it was shared, then it was also dangerous. One afternoon, when the session ran over time, she caught herself laughing in a way she hadn't in years. It was unguarded, pure, and she could feel her therapist watching her, not with the distant professionalism of a doctor, but with something warmer. When the laughter faded, the silence that followed was thick. She could hear the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the lamp, and beneath it all, the pounding of her heart. She wanted to say something, anything, but her mouth was dry. The therapist finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't know how beautiful you are when you let yourself be free." The words hit her like a blow, gentle yet devastating. She wanted to cry, to run, to kiss her, all at once. Instead, she lowered her gaze, too afraid of what she might see in those eyes. Walking out that day felt different. The air was sharp, the city loud, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She replayed that sentence over and over, wondering if it had been intentional, wondering if it had slipped out unguarded. She couldn't focus on anything else. The idea that someone could see beauty in her when she had only ever seen brokenness shook her to the core. She wanted to tell herself it was nothing, that she was imagining it, that she was desperate for connection and projecting her desires onto someone who was only doing their job. But deep down, she knew. She knew by the way her body reacted, the way her heart ached when she thought of her. She wasn't imagining. She was falling, and there was no turning back. The city outside was waking up with its usual noise, cars honking, people rushing to jobs they hated, but inside her, everything was unusually quiet that morning. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, toothbrush forgotten in her hand, eyes locked on the woman staring back. There was something new in her gaze, something she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just exhaustion anymore, or grief, or the weight of carrying a broken past. It was longing. It was the shadow of a feeling she had promised herself she would never allow again. And yet here it was, flooding her veins every time she thought of those eyes that seemed to see her more deeply than anyone else ever had. She told herself she was being foolish. This was therapy, not love. This was healing, not romance. But her body didn't believe the lie. Her body leaned forward each time. Her body noticed the smallest details, the faint perfume, the way a strand of hair slipped free, the curve of her lips when she smiled gently at her struggles. The ache of wanting became harder to silence. By the time she entered the office that afternoon, her heart was already racing. The therapist greeted her with that calm warmth, the kind that felt like stepping into a different world. A world where judgment didn't exist, where she wasn't defined by her scars. She sat down, trying to act casual, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. The conversation began like always, with questions about her week, her sleep, her thoughts. But her mind wasn't on the answers. Her mind was on the space between them, the invisible thread pulling tighter with every shared glance. She wanted to fight it, to shove it down, to protect herself from the disaster she knew could follow. But every word spoken in that room drew her closer, like waves pulling her under, and she was tired of resisting. That day, she spoke about loneliness again, not as an abstract weight, but as a living thing that haunted her. She admitted how the nights were hardest, how the silence pressed too close, how she sometimes woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there. Her therapist listened intently, her eyes soft, her face unreadable except for the slightest furrow in her brow. Then came a question, simple yet devastating: what is it you really need? It wasn't asked like a checklist for coping mechanisms. It was asked like an invitation, like she was daring her to strip herself bare. She opened her mouth, ready to list things like connection, safety, love, but the word caught in her throat. Because what she wanted at that moment wasn't a list. It was her. The silence stretched, and she thought she might shatter under the weight of it. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. The therapist didn't press further, but something flickered in her expression, something that made her breath hitch. She felt seen in a way that made her chest ache. She felt like all her carefully hidden desires were laid bare, and though no words were spoken, it was as if they had shared a secret too fragile to name. When the session ended, she didn't move right away. She lingered, fingers tracing the edge of the cushion, reluctant to step back into the noise of the world outside. The therapist stood slowly, walking her to the door as always, but when their hands brushed accidentally, it felt like fire. It was nothing more than a fleeting touch, the kind that could easily be dismissed, but for her it was everything. Her breath caught, her pulse raced, and she had to force herself not to look back as she stepped into the hallway. She walked home that evening in a daze, the city blurring around her. In her apartment, she sank onto the couch, her mind spinning. It wasn't just about the words spoken anymore. It was about the silences, the pauses, the way the air thickened between them like something unspoken was demanding to be acknowledged. She replayed every detail, dissecting the way her therapist's eyes lingered just a little too long, the way her tone softened when she confessed her pain, the way she seemed to hold space not just as a professional, but as a woman who cared in a way that went beyond duty. She wanted to dismiss it, to call herself delusional, but she couldn't. The evidence was there, pulsing in her veins, heating her skin. Long after she left that office that night, she lay in bed with the lamp casting shadows across the room, and she couldn't stop imagining what it would feel like to close the space between them. She wondered if her therapist thought about her when the sessions ended, if she ever felt the same pull that haunted her every waking moment. She buried her face in the pillow, torn between shame and desire, between fear of losing the one person who made her feel alive again and the craving to know what those lips would taste like. Sleep came late, restless and uneven, filled with dreams that left her shaking when the morning came. And for the first time, she admitted to herself what she had been denying all along: she was no longer just a patient. She was a woman in love, and it was only a matter of time before the truth broke free. The next session felt different from the moment she walked in. The air seemed heavier, like the room itself knew what was happening between them, like the walls could feel the tension that both of them refused to name. She sat down on the familiar couch, her hands clutching the throw pillow as if it could shield her from her own thoughts. The therapist gave her the same soft smile she always did, but this time it lingered, and that lingering made her heart trip over itself. She told herself to focus, to keep the conversation safe, to talk about work or the weather or anything that didn't reveal the way her chest burned with longing. But the therapist had a way of steering her words, of breaking down her walls without ever raising her voice. They began with questions about her week, but quickly, the topic slipped into vulnerability. She admitted she had been struggling to sleep again, not because of nightmares this time, but because of her own thoughts. She confessed that her mind was restless, caught in loops she couldn't escape. The therapist leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she asked, "What is it you keep thinking about?" The question was simple, but it sent a chill through her. She wanted to lie, to brush it off with something harmless, but the truth clawed at her throat. She dropped her gaze to the carpet and whispered, "I can't tell you." That silence that followed was suffocating, yet electrifying. The therapist didn't push. She only said softly, "Sometimes the things we're most afraid to say are the ones that need to be spoken." Her words felt like an invitation, like a door cracked open just enough to make her wonder if she dared to walk through. Her pulse raced as she considered it, her body tense with the weight of unspoken feelings. She shook her head, muttering something about not being ready, and the therapist only nodded with understanding. But the look in her eyes told her she already knew. When the session ended, she moved slowly, reluctant to leave. She reached for her bag, her fingers brushing against the therapist's hand in a moment that neither of them pulled away from. The touch was brief, but it lingered in her chest like a brand. She muttered a quick goodbye and left, but the memory of that touch haunted her long after the door closed behind her. That night, she couldn't escape it. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, wondering what line she was tiptoeing across. She told herself it was impossible, inappropriate, that she was confusing gratitude with desire, care with love. But every time she repeated those words, her body betrayed her. Her heart wouldn't slow when she replayed the look in her therapist's eyes, the softness in her tone, the way her hand had lingered just a second too long. It wasn't just her imagination. Something was there. Something unspoken, yes, but real. The following week, she almost didn't go. She sat outside the office in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, debating whether she could handle another hour of being so close and yet so far. But she couldn't stay away. She walked in late, apologizing nervously, and the therapist only smiled gently, telling her it was fine. She sat down, and once again, the conversation found its way to the heart of her. She didn't mean to, but the words slipped out, how she hated the emptiness of her apartment, how she longed for connection, how she was afraid she would never feel safe in someone's arms again. She didn't say whose arms she was imagining, but the way her therapist looked at her made her wonder if she even needed to. At one point, tears slipped down her cheeks without warning. She hated crying, hated showing that kind of weakness, but her therapist reached over with a box of tissues and placed it gently in her lap. Their fingers brushed again, and this time, neither of them pulled away quickly. The warmth of that skin against hers sent waves through her entire body. She wiped her tears and tried to laugh it off, but the therapist's eyes never left hers. They stayed locked, caught in a silence so thick it felt like the air had stopped moving. And for a heartbeat, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. That night, she dreamed of her. Not in fragments or symbols, but vividly. She dreamed of being held, of being kissed, of being touched in a way that erased every scar and made her feel whole again. She woke up breathless, her skin burning, her heart aching with the realization that this was no longer something she could run from. This wasn't a passing attraction. It wasn't admiration. It was love, raw and dangerous and undeniable. And the thought of walking into that office again both thrilled her and terrified her, because she knew with every passing day, she was one step closer to crossing the line they both pretended didn't exist. She didn't recognize herself anymore. The woman who had first walked into that office broken and guarded had slowly been replaced by someone trembling at the edge of desire, someone who couldn't control her pulse, someone who spent hours staring at the ceiling wondering if she had already gone too far in her heart. By the time the next session came, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. Every glance, every word, every silence carried too much weight now. She entered the office with her chest tight, rehearsing lies she would tell if her thoughts slipped out, but the moment she saw that familiar smile, all her defenses began to crumble. The session began quietly, the therapist asking gentle questions about her week. She tried to answer, but her voice shook in places where it shouldn't have. She talked about work, about the small details of her life, but she could feel her heart hammering with every second. She avoided eye contact at first, terrified of what might spill out if she let herself be seen too closely. But when she finally looked up, those eyes were already waiting, steady and calm, and her breath caught in her throat. Something inside her whispered that this was the moment, that the truth she had buried for weeks was clawing its way to the surface. She hesitated, words pressing against her lips. She wanted to confess everything, that she thought about her at night, that her voice lingered in her dreams, that she had begun to imagine what it would be like to close the space between them. But the fear of rejection, of destroying the fragile bond that had saved her, made her choke. Instead, she said, "I feel like I'm carrying something I can't name." Her therapist leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, "Maybe it's time to name it." The sentence sent a rush of heat through her, her stomach tightening, her palms damp with nervous energy. It was as if her secret had already been exposed, as if they both knew exactly what was being left unsaid. For the rest of that hour, her words stumbled between half-truths and silence. She admitted she was lonely, admitted she craved closeness, admitted she feared she would never be able to trust love again. Her therapist didn't interrupt, didn't write anything down, didn't even glance at the clock. She just listened with an intensity that felt almost unbearable, as if every word mattered more than time, more than rules. At one point, when her voice cracked, the therapist reached across the space between them and gently touched her hand. The contact was light, almost tentative, but it sent electricity racing up her arm. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the world shrinking until there was nothing but that touch. When the session ended, she didn't want to leave. She lingered near the door, her hand on the knob, her body turned slightly back as if waiting for something to stop her. The therapist walked her to the threshold as always, but there was hesitation in her movements, as though she too was reluctant to end whatever had been building. Their eyes locked again, and in that silence, it felt as if an entire conversation passed between them without a single word spoken. She finally forced herself to step out, her legs weak, her chest burning, her mind spinning with everything unspoken. That night, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She paced the floor of her apartment, her heart racing, her skin buzzing as though still carrying the warmth of that touch. She poured out words into a notebook, writing sentences she could never say aloud. She wrote about how she loved the way her therapist listened without judgment, how her smile felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, how she wanted to know her outside of the confines of an hour-long session. She wrote about longing, about fear, about the way her heart had chosen someone she wasn't supposed to choose. By the time she stopped, her cheeks were wet with tears. In the days that followed, she began to notice how her entire life was shifting around this secret. Songs on the radio seemed to speak directly to her. Couples holding hands on the street made her ache with jealousy. Even simple things, like the scent of lavender in a store, reminded her of that office, of her, of everything she was craving but couldn't have. It was unbearable and intoxicating all at once. She didn't know how much longer she could keep holding it inside. She was living in two worlds, one where she was the patient, careful, composed, guarded, and another where she was simply a woman in love, desperate to be touched, desperate to be chosen, and with every passing day, the line between those worlds blurred a little more. She didn't know if she wanted to resist anymore. She didn't know if she even could. All she knew was that when she closed her eyes at night, she saw her therapist's face, heard her voice, felt her hand lingering on hers. And when she woke, her heart ached with the same unspoken truth. She was falling deeper, and there was no way back.
She told herself she wouldn't let it show, that she could walk into that office and sit on the couch like every other time, speak about her life in safe fragments, and leave with her secret still locked away. But from the moment she stepped inside, she knew it was impossible. Her heart betrayed her, pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard. The therapist welcomed her with that same warm voice, but today, there was something different in the air, a tension that felt alive. She sat down slowly, trying to steady her breath, but the silence between them was louder than any words could have been. It was the kind of silence that vibrated, that hinted at something both of them were afraid to touch yet couldn't ignore anymore. She began to talk, filling the space with anything she could think of, her long walks, the books she was pretending to read, the way work had drained her, but her words felt hollow, like smoke meant to distract from the fire burning inside her. She caught herself glancing up too often, her eyes betraying her hunger every time they met the therapist's steady gaze. She saw it there too, just for a second, a flicker of something softer than professionalism, something human and raw. And in that fleeting glance, she realized it wasn't only her carrying the weight of this secret. The conversation shifted when the therapist asked, "What do you fear the most right now?" The question pierced her like a blade. She wanted to laugh it off, to deflect with something vague, but her throat tightened. The truth pulsed inside her, begging to be spoken. She hesitated, her hands trembling against her knees, and finally whispered, "That I want something I'm not allowed to want." The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, and her chest heaved as if she had just confessed a crime. Her therapist's eyes softened, her lips parting slightly as if she had been waiting for this. No judgment came, no lecture, only a quiet stillness that told her the meaning had been understood. Her hands were cold, her body on edge, but then came the smallest movement that shattered her world. The therapist reached out, not with hesitation, but with intent, her fingers brushing gently against hers. The touch was grounding and electric all at once, a touch that said, "I hear you, and I feel it too." She froze, her breath stuck in her chest, afraid that any sudden motion would break the spell. And then, slowly, she turned her hand upward, letting their fingers weave together for the briefest moment before pulling back. It was barely anything, but it felt like everything she had been aching for. The rest of the session passed in a blur. Words became background noise. Every detail faded compared to that single, undeniable touch. She left the office with her legs weak, her hands still tingling, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never dared to imagine before. The city felt different that evening, the noise and lights muted beneath the pounding of her heart. She wanted to scream into the night sky, wanted to confess her secret to the stars, wanted to hold on to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't one-sided. At home, she paced her apartment restlessly. She thought of the rules, of the boundaries that had been shattered in a single moment, of the cost of following her heart into forbidden territory. But she also thought of the look in her therapist's eyes, the warmth of her touch, the way the world had seemed to pause around them. She had been drowning for so long, and for the first time, she felt like someone had pulled her above the water. The risk terrified her, but the thought of walking away was even worse. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling with tears slipping silently down her face. They weren't tears of pain, but of longing so deep it hurt. She knew nothing had been said out loud, yet everything had been spoken in that silence, in that brief intertwining of fingers. She knew they were no longer just therapist and patient. They had crossed into something unnamed, something both dangerous and beautiful. And even though the fear still gripped her, she also knew she couldn't stop now. Whatever came next, she was already too far gone.
The days leading up to her next session felt like an eternity. She moved through her routines in a daze, her body present but her mind trapped in that office, in that moment when their fingers had touched and lingered. Every small detail of her life felt charged with new meaning. The smell of lavender on the street pulled her back to that room. The sound of a soft laugh in a cafe made her think of her therapist's voice. Even the silence in her apartment carried a weight now, a reminder of how much she craved a presence that could fill it. She tried to distract herself, burying her thoughts in meaningless tasks, but the truth followed her everywhere. She was consumed by a hunger that was no longer abstract. It had a face, a touch, a name. She whispered into her pillow at night. When the day finally arrived, she felt her whole body trembling as she walked to the office. The world outside seemed loud and chaotic, but as soon as she stepped inside, everything went still. The therapist greeted her with that familiar calmness, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that told her the touch they had shared was not forgotten. She sat down carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from reaching across the space again. The silence at the start of the session stretched longer than usual, as if both of them were waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, she broke it, her voice soft and hesitant. "I don't know how to do this anymore." The therapist tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching, and asked, "Do what?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and said, "Pretend I don't feel what I feel." The air thickened instantly, the words crashing into the space between them. She could feel her pulse in her temples, her body shaking with the weight of her confession. The therapist leaned back, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened into something both tender and torn. "You know this isn't simple," the therapist said quietly. Her voice carried layers, professional caution, personal ache, unspoken desire. "I know," she whispered, "but it's real. And it's eating me alive." She expected rejection, a wall slammed down, a reminder of boundaries. Instead, what she saw was conflict. The therapist's eyes glistened, her lips pressed together as if holding back words that wanted to escape. And in that silence, she felt a strange kind of freedom, because the conflict itself was proof that this wasn't one-sided. The session drifted after that, their conversation circling around feelings without naming them directly. She admitted how she had been dreaming of closeness, of touch, of love that felt safe again. She didn't use names, but she didn't have to. Every pause, every glance, every tremor in her voice carried the truth. The therapist didn't shut her down. Instead, she listened with a quiet intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and cherished. At one point, when tears slipped down her cheeks, the therapist moved closer than before, offering tissues but also letting her knee brush gently against hers. That small contact felt like a promise, like a secret agreement that something had shifted and would never shift back. When the hour ended, she couldn't move. She sat frozen, her heart refusing to let her walk away. The therapist stood slowly, then hesitated before reaching out. This time, when their hands touched, there was no pulling away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had been waiting for this all along. The therapist's voice was barely audible, trembling with restraint. "This is dangerous." She squeezed her hand softly and replied, "So is living without it." Leaving the office that day felt like stepping into a different universe. The city buzzed as usual, but inside her, everything had changed. There was no more denying, no more convincing herself it was fantasy. They had crossed into something undeniable. It wasn't spoken aloud in full, but it didn't need to be. The truth was alive in every nerve of her body. She walked home with tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, finally being desired, finally being met where she had been waiting for so long. That night, she curled into bed with her body still humming from the memory of that touch. She thought about the risks, the consequences, the rules they had broken, but none of it scared her as much as the thought of letting go. She realized she would rather risk everything than return to the emptiness she had known before. For the first time in years, she felt alive, and no matter what came next, there was no turning back. The final time she walked into that office, her steps were slow, deliberate, her heart pounding with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. She could feel the tension in her chest, heavy but not suffocating anymore, because she knew what she wanted, and she knew the truth could no longer stay buried. The room looked the same, soft light spilling from the lamp, the faint smell of lavender in the air, the quiet hum of a world standing still inside those four walls, but nothing about it felt the same. This was no longer just therapy. This was a meeting point of two souls who had been circling each other, afraid to collide, yet unable to resist the pull. She sat down on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap, and for the first time she didn't try to hide it. She let the tremor show, let the cracks reveal themselves, because there was no point pretending anymore. The therapist studied her with eyes that carried both caution and longing, as if she too knew the moment they had been dancing around had finally arrived. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation, until she finally whispered, "I can't do this anymore." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. The therapist's brow furrowed slightly. "Do what?" The answer came without hesitation this time, raw and unguarded. "Pretend that what I feel for you isn't real." The words filled the room like thunder, undeniable, irreversible. For a heartbeat, she thought the world might collapse under the weight of what she had confessed. But instead of rejection, what she saw in those eyes was relief, as if her truth had released something that had been locked away for too long. The therapist moved closer, her breath unsteady, her voice trembling as she admitted, "You don't know how many times I've told myself this couldn't happen." Her chest tightened at the words, a mix of fear and joy twisting together. "And yet here we are," she whispered back. Their eyes locked, the silence between them louder than any confession could ever be. Then came the moment she had dreamed of, imagined 1,000 times but never believed could be real. The therapist reached for her hand, not cautiously this time, but with certainty. Their fingers intertwined, and the warmth of that touch spread through her like fire, burning away every shadow of doubt. She leaned in, her heart racing so fast she could barely breathe, and before she could second-guess herself, their lips met. It was soft at first, hesitant, trembling, but it carried years of longing, months of silence, weeks of holding back what both of them already knew. The kiss deepened slowly, carefully, as if both of them were afraid the world might shatter if they let go completely. And maybe it would, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the truth they had been running from, now alive between them. When they finally pulled apart, tears streaked her cheeks, though she hadn't even noticed them falling. She laughed softly, a broken, disbelieving laugh. "I don't know what happens now." The therapist brushed a thumb gently across her cheek, her own eyes glassy with emotion. "Neither do I," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to keep pretending." The honesty in her voice struck deep, a balm on every wound she had carried for so long. They sat there in the quiet, holding each other's hands, letting the weight of their choice sink in. The risks were still there, the rules, the consequences, the uncertainty of what came next, but none of it felt as terrifying as it once had. Because for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. She wasn't invisible anymore, wasn't carrying her pain in silence. She had someone who saw her, who wanted her, who chose her despite everything. That realization filled her with a strength she hadn't known she still had. When she left the office that evening, the world outside hadn't changed, the city still buzzed with noise. The air still smelled faintly of rain, strangers still rushed past her with their own stories, but inside, everything was different. She walked with her head higher, her chest lighter, her steps steady. For years she had felt broken, unworthy, unseen, but now she carried proof that she was more than her scars. Love had found her in the most unlikely place. Love had dared to cross boundaries, and love had reminded her she was still alive. That night, she lay in bed, her body still humming with the memory of that kiss, her heart full in a way she had almost forgotten it could be. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe there would be struggles, maybe judgment, maybe battles they would have to fight. But she no longer feared the unknown. Because in that office, with one touch, one kiss, one truth finally spoken, she had found something priceless, something stronger than fear, something worth every risk. And as sleep pulled her into dreams, she held on to the only certainty that mattered. She had finally found where she belonged.